Good afternoon, everyone. So just very briefly, a couple of openings. One is just a general acknowledgement, which is also interesting to note. As everybody who's done this before knows, the session immediately after lunch is always the death session, because we're all digesting carbohydrates, and the energy level, at least if it's working properly, should drop. I want to just also mention, just to start off with very briefly, I appreciate very much what Alla said before about being a sociologist, and in a way you sort of self-declare who you are before you start, so you know, the audience knows what to expect. I come from, I teach Jewish history, but I'm approaching this, I guess, my interest and my involvement in the field is in the field of education, Jewish education in particular. I say it, by the way, because I have a sense that as we kind of take this model, this question of heritage tourism, and kind of go round and about it and look at it from a number of different points of view, we've actually already come to a couple of points, looking at it from the point of view of the site, looking at it from the point of view of the agency or the institution, maybe from the tourist, but now we come to it from the point of view of the educator, or from and in that respect, by the way, I mean, a little bit of balancing between theory and practice. Most of what I have to say here is personal. It's a reflective practitioner's approach, so I sort of frame it and offer it to you in those terms. I will, though, nonetheless say, very famously in the sort of kind of almost classic sort of element of Joseph Schwab's classic model of four common places of education being the teacher, the student, the curriculum, and the environment. It's useful, by the way, I think for analyzing tourism, at least here, because acknowledging the environment and the curriculum, here I guess I want to talk about the role of the teacher. So with all that said and done, I'll start anecdotally. The moment as I was being thrown off the Acropolis by a by an armed guard, me protesting, "No, I'm not guiding. I'm just educating. Cut no ice." And as I was trying to explain that he wants to talk, I just want to have a conversation with Jews about paganism and Hellenism. Is that not okay with you? And it's a similar version, by the way, and there are plenty of these. Similarly, in this case, it was an armed guard escorting me off the premises out of the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And I was trying to explain to him as he had his arm around my throat, that in fact I was more than happy to have the guide, but since what I was there to talk, what the guide wants to talk about annoyingly is the actual Hall of Mirrors, and what I wanted to talk about was what had taken place in the Hall of Mirrors. And if he wasn't going to talk about the minority rights treaty that was sort of came out of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War and its relevance to the Jewish question, particularly about national minority rights in Eastern Europe, if he wasn't going to do that, then it was my human right to have a group there and to talk about what I wanted to talk about. And it's one of the reasons why I kind of put up there that as an opener, I realize, and I say this with full disclosure, and I've been listening very carefully to think about the speakers and maybe some of the agencies representative, whether I would fall foul as well. I reckon, I don't mean it personally, I mean I say professionally, how many of the people in the room would me or people like me actually genuinely upset or offend? Because tourism and education could go together, but there are lots of hyphenated versions of tourism, cultural tourism, food tourism, and so on. Educational tourism, I think, is changing. Education is a value system as well as a practice, and therefore I wonder whether, in fact, I've tried to illustrate it here. Maybe that's a better version of it, which is that they could look very similar, but actually never cross over, which is my model from before. Whereas here, you know, maybe you could argue that there are points of what? Can you hear? Take it away. Too loud. Sorry. Oh, that's human nature. But yeah. It's fine, we're just meeting, and now it becomes clear what my students have to suffer on a daily basis. So what I want to say here is that there's a certain amount of, when the two things, this is the problem, I'm going to have to balance, because of trying to put together what is specifically here in the nature of educational tourism. And it might be that this is really meat and milk, and they either shouldn't go together, sometimes go together. Some people are very happy with them being together, but nonetheless, in my sense, there's an overlap, but I want to try and start with just specifically talking about a little bit about education. This is clearly not the time to revisit every single, everything there is to say about the theories of tourism and education. education, starting a little bit with the world of tourism. Here I want to borrow from the British philosopher Alain de Botton in his wonderful popular philosophy book on the art of travel, which some of you may have read. I'm not going to read all of it, but he asks, what would it mean to seek knowledge for life from one's travels? Oops. And what he's kind of asking is that travel is in some way connected to life and whatever it is we're trying to get out of it. And he writes the following. Nietzsche, I won't give you the context why we're suddenly talking about Nietzsche, but Nietzsche suggested a second kind of tourism whereby we may learn how our societies and identities have been formed by the past and so acquire a sense of, and here I've underlined and put in bold, community and belonging. The person practicing this type of tourism looks beyond his own individual transitory existence and feels himself to be the spirit of his house, his race, his city. He can gaze at old buildings and feel the happiness of knowing that one is not wholly accidental and arbitrary, but grown out of a past, as is its air, flower, and fruit, and that one's existence is thus excused and indeed justified. Actually, if the essence is about community and belonging, he then returns to the core of it. He says, in terms of what we might come back from our travels with, we collect souvenirs. We might return from our journeys with a collection of small, unfated, but life-enhancing thoughts. And in my understanding that educational travel then, in a way I'll go in that direction. The kind of education that I'm thinking about is not purely knowledge-oriented. It's something much bigger than that. I think I've got my slides back to front, but anyway, in a way, not that there's anything wrong with knowing how many light bulbs there are in the Doheny synagogue, it's just that's not what I'm about. I mean, light is important, but maybe more theologically, philosophically, or whatever else. But anyway, in a way, what I wanted to do was to borrow just very briefly, because mainly I want to talk about a typology for the guide and then explain my title, but borrow really or introduce two educational thinkers. One is Barry Chazan, who will be familiar to some and maybe less familiar to others. He writes specifically in the field of Jewish informal education. I'm locating my analysis of tourist education in the field of informal education. And I rarely use PowerPoints and I realize that having just put that up on, I don't have to read it out now because you've read it. I'll just give you the summary. What Barry Chazan says is that he presents an 8-part model of what the philosophy of informal education is about, that education should be person-centered. Again, I'm using, this is Jewish education. I'm not a Jewish sort of nativist, supremacist, exclusivist. That's not my point. I'm just simply saying I'm coming from my field of in the field of Jewish education. If you take Jewish out, you'll get pretty much the same kind of model of what informal education. But he says that it's a person-centered Jewish education. It's about the centrality of the experience. There is a curriculum of experiences and values. It's an interactive process. It's a group experience. There's a culture of Jewish education. That might be quite specific, by the way. And it's an education that engages people, and we are looking for, crucially, the holistic educator. And in a way, what I suppose I want to say is about the role of the guide educator is that this must be a holistic model, and that's why I understand why I was thrown out of the Hall of Mirrors. My notion of the holistic educator is different from the security guard who tried to strangle me. I'll add on, he's got a little gift for this, for me, writing this paper, where he actually goes a bit more specific. He says if an educator's sole role is to give a good lecture about the Polish Kehillah in the 19th century, she is called a visiting lecturer. A person whose sole task is to take a group through the streets of Prague or Krakow is a tour guide. Only if the mission is to affect the total Jewish being of the traveler are they an informal Jewish educator. Again, with or without Jewish, depending on how specific you want to be. But that notion of really trying to mix a number of narratives, a number of different approaches together. I'm grateful to a colleague, mentor, teacher, Avram Infeld, because he allowed me to quote a little bit from this, which is his forthcoming book. And again, I won't read the whole thing out for you because as I'm talking, I realize that you're not looking at me, you're probably reading it, so that's multitasking, that's great. But the key thing is that what Avram Infeld does is that he distinguishes in Hebrew terminology between chinuch and limud, between education and learning, and he says it's about developing memories, cultivating feelings, attaching those feelings to concepts, and ultimately cultivating behaviors that derive from beliefs. And ultimately, I've thus come to believe that education is achieved through experiences and educational moments. We're repeating the notion of the holistic educator, and you can take that back to any of the environments and any of the subject matters that we've been in so far. So moving along, what I wanted to say is that summarizing my kind of rush through education and tourism is to say that it's holistic, it's values-oriented, and then what you have to do is to fill in the gaps. When you say value, what values? What are you actually talking about? And if I'm going, I'll just pluck one out of the air. Well, actually, I won't. I'll use my typology maybe as a way of explaining it. What I thought might be useful is to offer a 4-part typology of 4 different types of guide educator models and try and illustrate them by way of example. The first is as the illuminator archaeologist. I apologize, you've got a view from the Fisherman's Bastion in Budapest, and actually what I'm going to talk about is a small corner of a street in Mantova. I lost the picture, so that's the one that went in instead. What I actually wanted to point you to, because I just prefer I could ask you, what do you think you're looking at? If you stand on that vista looking down, and you may see any number of different things, I'm going to point you to something very particular as the teacher educator guide. I was thinking, by the way, my favorite, much preferred anecdote is there's at the corner of a road in Mantova in northern Italy, there is a small little piece of metal that sticks out of the wall. And it's the hinge of the ghetto gate, which when was torn down 188 years after it was put into the wall, is still there. And therefore it's either a little piece of metal or it's the whole point of education. That's what guiding is about for me. Because the story that I can I don't want the gate to be there because I don't want the Jews to be in the ghetto, but I want to talk about the Jews in the ghetto, and I can authenticate it by a tiny little piece of metal that sticks out of the wall. It's archaeology. The coin that we heard about before that can't be displayed, even though we can't display it, we know that of its existence. So the role of the guide to shine a light, to illuminate, to be an archaeologist, and there are multiple versions of it. Secondly, I'm going to say the guide is the film director, which is really about constructing narrative, directing and redirecting the gaze. Again, I'm very, I really want to go, I was writing furiously during Tomas's comments from before, but I want to say this. I understand why what you're looking at is an iconic image. My role as the guide, educator, film director, who knows, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to say is that when the group gets off the bus and stands at that iconic gate, what I actually want them to do is to not do what the logic of the flow of tourists walking is, which is to head straight into the camp. Because for me, the camp is a piece of German archaeology which has been dumped in Poland, and and a piece of human, whatever, it's a UNESCO site, so it's part of human civilization. But actually what I want to do is ask everybody, what are you here for? And what it basically comes down to, I'll cut through the long verbiage around it and say, just make a decision. In your priority, which way do you think you should stand by that gate? Because if you look inwards, you're going to find the Nazis. And you're certainly going to find the victims. But I have a sense, by the way, that as the film director, I'm also interested in making you turn around and face and look along the railway tracks. This was not created when the world was created. Those railway tracks brought Jews from Slovakia first, then from France, and eventually through all the other countries. And that's where I want to direct the gaze. I want the gaze to go to think about the holistic story of the Shoah. From that, there may be a question. And I'm not sure that the guide will naturally instinctively do that because because most groups don't come to look from where they've come from. That's the point of coming to the place. So that's fine, I'm not arguing with it. I'm simply saying that the guide, oh my God, I remember that moment from this morning. Let me move very quickly on. The guide is the master chef. So this is really about textures and activities and pedagogy and the actual experience of educating. Again, I couldn't find my students. I asked them and they wouldn't send me, so I sent a different picture. But actually, this is a group of people by a monument in Barcelona in of soldiers, Jews who fought in the international brigades. Actually, what I wanted to show you, which is a much more preferred site, which is where we're playing around with pedagogy. 22 Pilimo Street in Vilnius. In Vilna, is where the Jews gathered to have the election meeting in 1906 before the elections for the Duma. And what, rather than just talk about it as a historical thing, I would rather have the simulation activity, invite some people to speak up as if they were members of the Bund, and to ask another group of people to speak as if they're members of the Volkspartei, or those who are leaving for America, why are they there? Have the argument in the place, discuss what the history is about, and I'm not non-authenticating the site, I'm acknowledging the site is behind that window, but the window is just a window, and therefore me as the role as the guide, as the educator, is to try and craft the actual experience where the participant is involved. The last one is the role of dialogue. Some of these modes in this typology have been centered on the guide. And actually, the truth is, in that model of Schwab, the idea is that education takes place as a dialogue between all the four stases of education, between the educator, the student, the curriculum, and the environment. So dialogical education is at the heart of, I suppose, the model that I want to present. Tourist education must be dialogical, I think. There are times, again, I say it must. There are times, maybe where the dialogue has to happen after the event. So some of the pieces that were referred to this morning about Auschwitz and reflection and so on, it might be that that's not a place for talking, but at some point the dialogue does have to take place. I'm actually, the one I wanted to refer to is this picture. This is the Sarajevo Haggadah, standing inside. Now, admittedly, it depends when the museum's open, close, when it's being renovated, but I'll just say what I don't have is my photograph of a group of 30 participants on the program standing around the Sarajevo Haggadah. You stand around the Haggadah in order to Leila Seder, to read the Haggadah. It's about as participatory and as dialogical as you could possibly go. It's a tourist moment when it's a Haggadah from the 14th century. We listened to a fantastic recording of Vehisha Amda, which was written in the 8th century, and we had a conversation about the words of the Haggadah, Vehisha Amda. In every generation, people have risen up to kill the Jews. We're in Sarajevo, where actually Jews were killed but also rescued other people during the Civil War, and it was the most dialogical moment of tour guiding I can think of. And again, in a strange way, the Haggadah sitting in the middle of the room authenticated what the experience was about. I'm going to just go to my last part because I realize that time is almost up here, and maybe there'll be a chance for conversation later. In that rush through trying to present the different modes, there are lots of implications for training. How do you train somebody to do that? Is it okay for some cheeky British-born Israeli educator to rock up in any of your places where you are, not all of you, but some of you are, and then think that I have the right to educate at that point? I'll leave that there as a question. The reason for the title, I borrowed from a folk song. It's got nothing to do with being Jewish and anything. It's a folk song by a very angry Glaswegian, Scottish folk singer called Dick Gaughan, who wrote a lovely song called A Different Kind of Love Song. And he says in the song, when people complain to him about why you always sing songs about misery, about human suffering, about hardship, about history. And he says, I do, because these are the things that animate me, and history is not only about suffering. He says, all the songs that I sing are love songs. It's love of a different kind. And in that respect, it does return to the educator to put themselves right in the middle of this experience. I realize if I was a maths teacher, I'd have to be a triangle, but I'm not. I'm an educator, and I'm in my subject. If that didn't make sense, what I'm saying is, I'm part of the story too, so are my participants. I want to be in the story, and therefore, again, I don't know how maths teachers pull that one off. Finally, there's a lovely, really to combine the two. Empty car parks, it doesn't have to be empty car parks. I put that in there because I think it gives an image, a stereotype of Jewish tourism. But the idea that it's about love songs is that it's a poetics. There's a poetics in education as much as anything else. There is a lovely poem by a performance poet in Israel, Jonathan Blumenfeld, called Ech Masbirim et Yerushalayim Lanashim Zarim. How do you explain Jerusalem to people who don't know it, or to foreigners? And he goes through all the hardship and all the drama of Jerusalem as a place. And at the end of it's all the violent images, and it's all the controversy, and it's all the breakdown. And at the end of the poem, he says, "Aval be'etzem ze kol hatiferet, lo?" At the end of the day, that's where the glory is, no? And for me, that's what I would say is the role of the educator who's part of the story. I would come to these places because it's a different type of love song. Ze kol hatiferet, lo? That's the point. That's where all the glory is found.